Welcome to the second lecture of the 2021 season of Future of Oceans lecture series from the Port Townsend Marine Science Center. Now I believe this is the actual 7th cycle of this series, and first thing I want to do is thank the generous support from the Darrow family. They have been supporters of this lecture series all along, and we are so grateful to them. If we were in person at the Fort Worden Chapel, you could greet them and thank them yourselves, but I'm just going to try to do that for all of us. I hope you, I already heard them, I know they're here, so thank you both very much for your ongoing support of the lecture series. I'm Diane Quinn, I'm the program director for the Marine Science Center. I am stunt doubling for Janine Boire, our executive director, who couldn't be here today. But I just want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon and just say welcome wherever you are. Our format today is a lecture with Q&A at the end. As you can see from the slide, you will all stay muted with your videos off throughout the program. We suggest you use speaker view, which you can find up in the upper right corner of your screen if you haven't already learned every single thing about Zoom that there is to know in the last 8.5 months. If you want to share questions, please put them in chat. The chat goes to everyone, and then I'll try to monitor those questions and triage them and feed them to Betsy at the end of the presentation today. Those are all the big rules. The Marine Science Center's mission is to inspire conservation of the Salish Sea. And one of the ways we do this is through our public programs and our exhibits. In our exhibits, we get to communicate and highlight the really important work that's going on in our community and beyond, in restoration, in research, and in conservation, especially related to the marine environment. And one of the organizations that we are so proud and just relieved to get to work with is Puget Sound Restoration Fund. If you visited the aquarium in the last few years and gone into the conservation lab, you've seen the pinto abalone tanks, nursery tanks that are a baby version of what's going on at Puget Sound Restoration Fund. Or maybe you've just heard us talking about it, which we like to do, or read about this project on our website. But that is not the project that we asked Betsy Peabody to talk about today. We actually asked her to speak about one of the other priority programs that Puget Sound Restoration Fund is spearheading in Puget Sound. Betsy Peabody, I'm sure a lot of you know her and know her work and know the organization, but for those of you who don't, she founded and formed the nonprofit Puget Sound Restoration Fund in 1997. She's also the president of the Pacific Shellfish Institute. But Puget Sound Restoration Fund has a very inclusive and serious and important mission, which they play out in a lot of different ways, programs, but essentially in the work that they do, which is to restore marine resources through in-the-water projects that are focused on marine habitats, on water quality, and on species, especially in Puget Sound. Throughout Betsy's career, she's consistently shown her belief in the importance of collaboration, in building partnerships, and in the power of people working together to help recover a healthy ecosystem, and not just for us, but for everything that uses that ecosystem, and how important it is for us to acknowledge our role in the recovery of the place where we call home. So it's my honor today to introduce Betsy Peabody.
Thanks so much, Diane, and hello to everybody. I wish I could see all of your faces. It's nice to have a little Sunday matinee experience with all of you. But before I begin talking about kelp and our various immersions in the world of kelp, I also just want to say thank you to the Port Townsend Marine Science Center. I am a big admirer of the Marine Science Center. I think that they're just endlessly creative and inventive about connecting people to marine science. And I also just am so loving of the place where you live there in the Port Townsend area. There's just such a strong kelp signal there, and it's a place I go often to get a kelp experience myself. And so I think that kelp is just so much a part of your world, and I'm happy to be immersed in it myself and happy to have some time on a Sunday afternoon to talk about it. So first, as we begin, because there's a lot to talk about, I just wanted to show some of the faces of the people on our kelp team. And these are people who work at Puget Sound Restoration Fund and really advance many of our different kelp projects. And then also here is Joth Davis, with whom I have partnered to do a kelp investigation, which I'll be telling you about as well. But also there's just a whole galaxy of people beyond this group, many kelp gurus who have shared their knowledge with us and who have sort of joined hands with us to work on various kelp activities. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to give people sort of a roadmap for what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, we'll talk about the results of the sugar kelp ocean acidification investigation that we conducted at Hood Head. Secondly, we're going to be talking about all the research and development underway at Puget Sound Restoration Fund and with our many partners to develop techniques for restoring bull kelp forests. There are a lot of ins and outs of it, and there's just so much work in the years ahead that we're excited to be involved in that. And then also in 2020, we launched some underwater kelp ecological surveys that we're hoping to involve other organizations in carrying forward at multiple sites. So I wanted to tell you a bit about that. And then lastly, during this very peculiar year, we have been conjuring a 2021 kelp expedition that we're going to be leading next summer to delve further into the world of kelp. So we're excited to be dreaming about something that hopefully will pull us all out from under our rocks and into the world again. Okay, so next slide. Okay. So this is a big topic. We conducted a 5-year sugar kelp ocean acidification investigation at Hood Head, which is north of the Hood Canal Bridge. And we got funding for this project from the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation and the US Navy. And just to give you a little sort of tour through these pictures, you can see on the left the location of the investigation just north of the Hood Canal Bridge. The picture on the top shows what the demonstration site looked like there. And then on the right-hand side are 2 of the species that we used during biological assessments to see how kelp was affecting seawater conditions for biological organisms. So this is a little marine snail called a pteropod, and then Pacific oysters. And then the other species that we worked with were Olympia oysters, some pelagic gastropods, and also mussels. And then there in the center is a picture of the sugar kelp that we grew there at Hood Head as part of this investigation. So next slide. We worked with a lot of people, and we had lots of different teams working on different elements of this project, and some really world-class scientists helping us out. So we had the kelp team, and the kelp team was involved in cultivating sugar kelp and measuring all kinds of different kelp growth parameters during the course of the field investigation. There was the chemical assessment team from NOAA, UW, and DNR, and you can see those wonderful people there, and they were measuring seawater chemistry upstream and downstream of the kelp array. We were working with a biological assessment team, again, to suspend 5 different species, calcifying species within the kelp farm, and to measure whether or not the kelp resulted in any changes in growth or shell dissolution inside the kelp farm as compared to outside the kelp farm. We had a communications team, and then there was a modeling team that was developing a model and then that could graphically display the effect of kelp on various parameters. So that was the team. Next slide. And the idea for this project grew out of a Blue Ribbon panel report. And this was a panel that I participated in 2012, and it was appointed by then Governor Christine Gregoire. And over the course of that year, the panel recommended 42 actions that Washington State could take to address ocean acidification. And one of those actions was to investigate phytoremediation strategies. And basically that means just plant-based strategies for trying to improve seawater chemistry and improve conditions for species that might be vulnerable to corrosive conditions. And many people are familiar with other types of phytoremediation strategies. So all the different kids around the world that are planting trees to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, that is a type of phytoremediation strategy. And we were interested in seeing whether or not there was an action we could take in the marine system that might accomplish the same thing, removing carbon dioxide from the seawater, thereby improving conditions. Next slide. So our driving motivation for this particular investigation was because generally we wanted to develop a toolkit of local actions. There are things collectively that people are doing on the policy front. There were actions that were being taken and are being taken within hatcheries to improve seawater conditions, but really we wanted to investigate whether there were things we could do in the marine system that would improve seawater chemistry and improve conditions for all of the different species that are so important to ecosystem health and so important to our own human health. And if we could just come up with ways to try to capture some of that carbon and do something good with that. And then also if there were things that we could do now locally while we figure out the whole global carbon emissions issue. So next slide. So the first order of business after we settled on a site was to assess site conditions to see whether or not we could conduct this investigation there. You see the location of the site, that green rectangle north of the Hood Canal Bridge, so you can kind of zero in geographically on where we were. And of course, the biggest question was, can we grow sugar kelp there? And so pictured is Joth Davis, and there was a buoy at the site. And sure enough, on the line that connected the buoy, sugar kelp was growing naturally and abundantly. So that was a really good sign that this was a place where we might be able to grow sugar kelp at a commercial scale. Next slide. So before we could really do anything, we needed to obtain permits. And this was a very big undertaking, and we could spend a lot of time talking about this. We're not going to, because we have so much else to talk about. But I would just say that in the pre-application phase of the work, the most important thing was working with tribes. The site of the demonstration site was within the home waters of many different tribes that have treaty rights. So we really needed to discuss this with them and make sure that it was okay on their end. And then we needed to work closely with Jefferson County. These waters are within their jurisdiction. So there was a lot of pre-permit work, but the sticking point here was that a condition of our grant from the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation was that we needed to obtain permits before we could proceed with the project. So it was a big first hurdle that we had to overcome, and we're really pleased that we did. And so listed there are the permits that were involved in just getting us all squared away so we could begin. Next slide. So next order of business was installing the culture system, and I wanted to just give you a visual of what that looked like. You can see that there were some perimeter buoys marking that rectangular 2.5 acre site. You can see that there are big yellow buoys to the north and the south of the kelp array. Those buoys were installed by University of Washington Applied Physics Lab, and there are all kinds of instruments and sensors mounted on those buoys. And then the white lines mark the cultivation lines. And this is currently a kelp farm that is operated by Hood Canal Mariculture. But this is where we conducted the demonstration site. So now you see what it looks like. Next slide. Then we had to figure out how to propagate sugar kelp. And all of this was a first for us. But let me just say that kelp and sugar kelp is grown in many places around the world. So there are a lot of manuals, there's a lot of expertise, it can be done. And we just needed to set ourselves up to do that. So we set up a kelp lab at NOAA's Manchester Research Station, where we have a conservation hatchery. And it was at this site then that we propagated seeded line that could ultimately be outplanted at the Hood Head demonstration site. And you could see what those spools of seeded line looked like in the inside of aquaria tanks within our kelp lab, and what those little beautiful kelp sporophytes look like under a microscope. And in the lower right, you see what the kelp line looks like. That seeded line basically looks like brown fuzz when it's ready to be outplanted at the site in December, in the cold weather of December. And we put all of those spools of seeded line in a fish tote and take them out to the site where we spool them around the cultivation lines. Next slide rather. And then we needed to cultivate sugar kelp during 2 years of field investigation in 2017 and 2018, so that we could provide the kelp, and so that the chemical and biological assessment teams could come in and do various measurements as the kelp was growing. And we were investigating the potential for seaweeds to mitigate ocean acidification locally. And you can see there that the kelp did grow. So it began as brown fuzz, actually turned into abundant sugar kelp, which was kind of a miraculous thing to see. Next slide. So we did a lot of measurements during those particular field investigations, and you can see how big just an individual sugar kelp plant can be, but also you can see how densely it grew on those seeded lines. So we were really pleased with that aspect of it. In 2017, the first year of field investigation at peak production, there was 19.4 metric tons of sugar kelp, and that sugar kelp contained within it lots of carbon and nitrogen, and you can see those figures there, the percentage by dry weight. And that carbon, and you can see that if we had removed that kelp biomass at peak production, we would have been removing that amount of carbon from the marine system. So providing that type of marine carbon dioxide removal. And but what we did was we left the sugar kelp in the water for the full season. And then at the end of the season, so that the various scientists could do their measurement, and at the end of the season, we harvested 6.3 metric tons of sugar kelp, and we delivered it to an organic farm on Whidbey Island, where it was used for soil enrichment. And the whole idea there is that you have nutrients flowing off the land, feeding these waters. The kelp, as it was growing, was absorbing carbon and nitrogen, and then at harvest, we were reconveying those nutrients back on land in a kind of virtuous cycle, bringing them back onto the land where they could enrich soils and boost food production. So next slide. Then during this whole time, the scientists were assessing chemistry and biology, and you could see some of the equipment that was used, the mooring buoys that were being mounted with the different sensors. The long cylindrical tubes on the right are the mesocosms that were used to suspend pteropods within the kelp farm. You can see Dick Feely there on the lower right, one of the premier chemical oceanographers, sort of at the leading edge of ocean acidification science. And he was there helping us collect our samples. So a lot of different people involved in this. Next slide. And then we also had our team of modelers developing a model. And this particular slide shows what was happening with dissolved inorganic carbon within the rectangular space of that kelp array. And the largest decrease in dissolved inorganic carbon took place within the center of the kelp field. So the model indicated that there were localized effects on water chemistry due to the kelp farm, but that the effects were too small to be measured in the field. Because basically the signal of that kelp farm was small compared to the background noise, just that big marine system in which we were growing our kelp. Next slide. So I wanted to just summarize the results of this because we have some other kelp topics that we want to get to. Next slide. So first off, we were able to demonstrate and show that Puget Sound abounds with native kelps and seaweeds, many of which can be cultivated successfully to produce high quality material and provide benefits. So we had 2 successful years of kelp cultivation, and the commercial farm there at Hood Head, owned and operated by Hood Canal Mariculture, is carrying that work forward and conducting all kinds of additional research. Next slide. We also learned that location is key. If you're going to cultivate kelp for the purpose of generating multiple benefits, you want to make sure that you're doing that in the right spot where conditions make those benefits possible. And this is similar to any kind of mitigation or restoration project that you might be doing in the marine system. For instance, if you want to do eelgrass mitigation or restoration, you want to be doing that in a place that has the conditions that can support that. So the same is true. Next slide. With kelp cultivation. So you can't just grow kelp anywhere and expect that it's going to improve seawater locally. There are conditions that you need to pay attention to. Next slide. So the localized effects of kelp farming are going to depend on currents, the density at which you cultivate kelp, and also the scale of the operation. Next slide. At Hood Head, as I've said, or as I think I've said, the currents were too fast for the kelp effect to be detected. It's a highly dynamic place. It was incredibly good in terms of growing kelp, but the water residence time was too slow for the instruments to detect that effect on the seawater chemistry. Next slide. But the model that we used, that was developed for this project, really defined the conditions under which kelp farming could improve seawater chemistry. So you can make adjustments in the model, and you can change, for instance, the currents, change the density, and you can show, for instance, that the drawdown of dissolved inorganic carbon can be boosted by increasing the density of the kelp planted, or increasing the scale, or reducing the currents. Next slide. And there was also sort of a prototype model component that was developed that can assist in evaluating new kelp farm sites in the years ahead. Next slide. And then importantly, our preliminary results show that kelp may benefit sensitive organisms, organisms that are sensitive to corrosive conditions. So as I've said, we experimented with 5 different calcifying species: pteropods, pelagic gastropods, mussels, Pacific oysters, and Olympia oysters. And all 5 of those species showed less shell dissolution occurring inside the kelp farm as compared to outside the kelp farm. And 2 of the species, Pacific oysters and Olympia oysters, showed increased growth within the kelp farm versus outside the kelp farm. There were likely many different things contributing to that, and more science that needs to be done on the road ahead, and also lots more to learn about how to co-culture shellfish and seaweed optimally in order to get multiple benefits. Next slide. So I think we learned that kelp cultivation is not a basin-wide solution to ocean acidification, and I don't think anybody thought that it would be going into it, but it can assist with marine carbon dioxide removal, and where conditions are right, maybe it can be a tool in our toolkit. So we're just about to switch topics, and we're going to move on to the second item in the list. So just want everybody to have their seatbelts fastened so you're ready for a change of topic. Next slide. Okay, so restoring bull kelp forests is something that we have been immersed in as an organization for about 10 years, really trying to figure this out. And there are lots of ins and outs of it. And it is a unique, bull kelp forests are a unique living biogenic habitat. They're incredibly important as a food web enhancer. They're capturing carbon dioxide in the marine system, and they're transforming it into biomass that makes it useful in the food web. And so many of the seafoods that we love and the species that abound here in Puget Sound depend to some degree on bull kelp or on kelp in general, and have kelp in them as part of their biomass. So just really important as a carbon engine in the near shore. And there is documented loss of bull kelp forests in Central and South Sound. And so that's a real precipitator in the work that we're trying to do. Next slide. So just to kind of zero in on that and give you a visual, Department of Natural Resources has produced this map that shows graphically just how much bull kelp has been lost in the South Sound, and all of those different colored segments of shore used to have bull kelp back in the late 1800s. But today, only the green segments of shoreline still have bull kelp. So that is a significant loss of bull kelp in the South Sound. And so we're definitely under the gun in terms of trying to develop a restoration practice so that we can try to restore viable kelp beds at a meaningful scale. Next slide. So we're in the kitchen on this, trying to figure this out. And we're using techniques that are available to us now, but we're trying to develop new techniques as well. And I just want to begin on the upper left-hand slide to show you where it all begins for us in the R&D lab. You can see a blade of bull kelp there, and the dark patches are the reproductive sections of those blades. So as the bull kelp matures throughout the year, it develops what are called sorus patches, those dark patches. And as those develop and they ultimately drop out of the kelp blade, towards the end of the year, and they're negatively buoyant. They drop to the bottom, and once they're at the bottom, they release spores. And so that's what gives rise to the kelp bed of the next year. So we're using that same reproductive material and bringing it into the kelp lab, and that's what we use to produce spores as well, and then to run through several different life stages before we have a material that can be outplanted into the marine system at a place that once hosted an historic kelp bed where we're trying to rebuild it. So we're at this stage of the game, we're using some aquaculture techniques, and you'll see those same seeded spools, and we're taking that seeded line. And if you go to the lower left-hand picture, at a couple of our different experimental sites, we have these pyramid-shaped concrete blocks, and we're wrapping the seeded line around those concrete blocks. And then you could see, as you move right, you can see the kelp bed developing on those blocks throughout the year, growing, maturing. And then in the lower right, that picture is a very significant picture because one of our sites is at Doquigwitz, otherwise known as Jefferson Head, and this is within the Suquamish tribes waters, and we're doing this we're doing this project in partnership with them and also with NOAA. And this is a site that hosted a kelp bed up until the early 90s. It disappeared at that point, but that shows you at this experimental site that we have a kelp bed with kelp that matured and that reached the surface and developed blades that have reproductive material that we hope will give rise to next year's kelp bed at that site. Next slide. Okay, so next on the agenda is talking about underwater ecological surveys. So during this odd year of 2020, this was one of the ideas that we hatched and initiated with NOAA funding. And this is embarking on underwater ecological surveys in Puget Sound. Bull kelp forests are foundational pieces of a healthy marine ecosystem, but unbelievably, there's never been a systematic survey, underwater ecological survey of bull kelp forests at multiple sites. So we initiated that in 2020, and we're going to be carrying it forward. There are 4 sites that Puget Sound Restoration Fund has adopted for annual monitoring using protocols that we've adapted. And we are looking for other entities and organizations to adopt bull kelp forests elsewhere in Puget Sound, perhaps in Jefferson County waters and elsewhere, so that we can develop a network of index sites that can be monitored moving forward, so we can keep our collective eyes on what's happening within these bull kelp forests, all the different species that live there, and how that is changing over time, so that we can rouse ourselves collectively if work is needed to try to hold on to these incredibly important features of the marine scape. So if there are any of you interested in adopting and monitoring an index site, please, of course, reach out. Next slide. Okay, so this brings me to the last topic, and I want to just spend a few minutes here. Another picture of a beautiful kelp forest and all the different fish and other species that live there. So I want, first of all, that to be the vision. And one of the things that we've conjured during this year is the idea of leading a kelp expedition in July of 2021 so that we can try to reimagine the kelp highway, what was once known as the kelp highway, that thick ribbon of kelp that lined much of the West Coast. And so we want to take this idea into Puget Sound and really look at a section of the kelp highway and try to figure out what's happening. Where are bull kelp forests still thriving and still abundant? What lives there? Where have they vanished? and begin to explore collectively why that is, so that we can build the kind of broad coalition that will be needed to protect and conserve and restore kelp ahead. Next slide. So just to sort of root this in history, so early trailblazing humans followed a coastal route that has come to be known as the Kelp Highway 16,000 or so years ago, and as they migrated from Asia to the Americas. And this was an incredibly important nearshore feature because it allowed boats to kind of hop and skip down that west coast of North America, and along that route in these kelp beds. And you've seen how many species live and thrive within those kelp beds. There were all these abundant foods that could sustain people as they migrated as well. So these kelp beds provided this sort of perfect marine subsistence package of foods that could support people as they moved. So this is really kind of a vision that has really inspired this idea of going back and really taking a look at this kelp highway and understanding the importance of kelp, not just for people who ventured into this part of the world long ago, but as a feature that makes it possible for us to live in this place today and for us to enjoy the seafoods that we do today. And so just to really connect the dots and get how fundamental this is, both for ecosystem health and human health. Next slide. So this is just to sort of immerse you in that vision of kelp and the nearshore space. And in 2020, there was a lot of really important work done by many different organizations. Next slide. And part of that work was developing a Puget Sound kelp conservation and recovery plan. And Northwest Straits Commission led the charge on this. And we were really fortunate to partner with them. NOAA provided the funding, and Department of Natural Resources was absolutely in the thick with marine agronomics. And we developed a conservation recovery plan that could provide a kind of roadmap for the work ahead. And this is just a beautiful starting point, but it is a starting point, okay? Because there's going to be a lot of work that's needed to conserve and restore kelp forests moving forward, particularly as seawater conditions are changing, and in some ways that will make it more challenging for kelps that are vulnerable to increasing seawater temperatures. So we really need to get our minds together and figure out how we're going to do the big lift on kelp conservation and recovery. And so we wanted a way to kind of breathe life into this effort and really engage lots of new partners. And so that's why and how we came up with the notion of a kelp expedition, because what could be more fun than a kelp expedition, particularly as we're all stuck at home. So it gave us a way of dreaming about the work ahead. Next slide. So this is what we're thinking of in terms of our initial expedition route. And I'll say that this is a 7-day science-based expedition, and we have support from the Pew Charitable Trusts, and then we have partnerships with so many people. But I just want to say at the outset that tribal partnerships and tribal leadership in this expedition is going to be critical, and we have some wonderful tribes who have already very enthusiastically jumped on board, including the Jamestown Sklallam tribe and the Samish Indian Nation and the Port Gamble Sklallam tribe. And we're working with many others because we are traveling through the home waters of these tribes as we begin our expedition near Freshwater Bay in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. We might also have a a pre-trip starting in the San Juan Islands. We're still working out the details, but ultimately we're going to be continuing this expedition all the way down to Olympia. On the way, we hope to be having gatherings with many people, many tribes, many organizations. We want to be learning as much indigenous knowledge as we can, sharing science, doing a lot of science. There will be scientific collections and mapping and all kinds of things happening during the course of the expedition, and a flotilla of boats participating in different ways. I want to do a call out to the people on this call, just simply because we are in search of two research vessels or charter boats that could be used to accommodate the core crew of scientists, which is about 16 to 20 people during this 7-day expedition in July of 2021. So if you have any brilliant ideas of boats that might be perfect for this, please, by all means, let me know. But other vessels will be involved in lots of different ways throughout the course. And we'll also hopefully be developing a kind of policy agenda, an idea about what conservation looks like, so that when we end in Olympia, we have some things that we could potentially present to legislators as actions that could be carried forward to help with kelp. Next slide. So in all the projects that I've described, and those just touch on all the kelp work that we're involved in and that so many others are doing, we collaborate with many, many people. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, these logos here. There are so many other collaborators, and I wish I could thank all of them. Next slide. But just want to say thank you to everyone for just signing up for this Sunday afternoon matinee, and thank you to the Port Townsend Marine Science Center again for reaching out and saying that they were interested in learning more about kelp. There's really no end of the kelp work that we could all be doing moving forward, and I'm excited about working with many of you on that. And so that's it for the presentation, but I'm here until 4 if anybody has questions or wants to talk more about this.
So I have a lot of questions that have come in on the chat, Betsy. I'm trying to move them over to a place where I can see them. If you're still, I see one that just has a great big thank you. Betsy, this would be the part where you would hear applause from all fronts. And unfortunately, we do not have a working sound effect.
Applause.
So I'm going to try to look through the questions really as quickly as possible. But the first question from way early on came from Peter Lavelle asking, Battelle National Labs at Squim are researching energy through kelp seaweed, and is your research, or how is your research involved in that project?
Well, I know that, or I suspect that Tom Mumford is involved in that work that you're doing at Battelle, and there is so much science to be done on kelp, and I'm so glad that Battelle is in the thick of that and doing that research. And I mean, the magic of kelp is manifold, and there's so many different things that can be done with kelp, you know, ranging from bioenergy to wonderful, beautiful foods that have all kinds of micronutrients that aren't available to us from terrestrial foods. And I even read recently that there was a type of hand sanitizer that was made using kelp. So kelp is really sort of a frontier. I mean, interestingly, it's both an historically important species, and I think a species on the horizon that has a lot of potential in producing many things and helping to solve many problems. So super glad that Battelle is involved in the energy side of the equation.
So let me kind of scroll through here. Just a quick note to people, the lecture will be, it's recorded, so it'll be online. So if you want to go back and check anything later, watch it again, look at the slides again, it'll be on our YouTube, PTMSC YouTube channel. So second question from Peter Lavelle. Kelp seaweed are good amendments for gardening. Are citizens able to harvest for personal use? And if not, where can one buy local kelp? Is local kelp seaweed safe to eat?
So many good questions. Okay, so recreationally, if you have a shellfish license, that allows you also to harvest some seaweed up to 10 pounds a day, I think is the limit. Department of Natural Resources has some really good guidance and some brochures, and I think it's DNR, though I think also Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife might also be distributing these brochures that really describe the best way to harvest that material, where to cut it so that you're not harming the plant itself. And so some recreational harvest is allowed. In terms of your question about seaweed used as compost material, it's interesting. I mean, seaweed has been used by people throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia, to enrich soils and enrich crops. And for some reason, that knowledge just sort of escaped us for a while, and now that old knowledge is being revived in all kinds of ways. And I know that on the eastern seaboard, people used to, gather seaweed on the rack line and bring it up to spread around their tomato plants for good growth. So, seaweed is again a very magical sort of resource. And yes, it's great as a soil amendment. There are some, I think Joth Davis and Hood Canal Mariculture and some seaweed farms, shellfish farms are looking into ways that that seaweed might be gathered and turned into some kind of locally grown product that could be used on organic farms. It could be also as kelp farms, or if kelp farms become more established in Puget Sound, there's an end of season material that is really good as soil amendment and could be possibly made available to people within the same watershed. There are ideas that we're trying to pursue with shellfish farmers in intertidal areas, whereby seaweed might be collected off of intertidal gear and transformed into a kind of soil amendment. Again, sort of trying to instigate this virtuous cycle of removing that carbon from the marine system and recycling it back up into the watershed. So I think there's a lot of potential there, and we need to really develop the systems that can enable that at a larger scale. Next question. Sorry.
Next question. From our sponsors, this question came in: why were sugar and bull kelps chosen for this research rather than some of the many other species?
Yeah, great question. And it reminds me that I forgot to mention that there are, around 24 different native kelps in Puget Sound. So again, Puget Sound abounds in native seaweeds and kelps, and it's one of the defining features of this marine ecosystem. We chose sugar kelp and bull kelp because sugar kelp is one of the species that's grown around the world. So the technique for propagating and cultivating it is pretty well established. And so that gave us confidence that because it's a native seaweed, we could be successful in doing that. Again, because we were doing it for the first time. So we wanted to begin strong, with something that we had reasonable confidence would work. We were very eager also to bring bull kelp into the experiment, though it proved complicating because we were thinking that we could have sugar kelp grown on cultivation lines 3 meters down, and that we could also be simultaneously in some areas be growing bull kelp so that we could create that 3-dimensional type of kelp space. And bull kelp, as all of you know who live in Jefferson County, it's this serpentine, unwielding, beautiful, mythic kind of plant species. And, you know, it's not a thing that's easy to control in the marine system. It has a mind of its own. So it was like, it proved to be too complicated, and we just needed to grow kelp. And so really growing sugar kelp was where we landed. And so that's why we zeroed in on those 2 species.
Okay. Wow, there are lots of questions here, Betsy. And I kind of almost, if we could bring Ron Tom into the conversation, it would be a lot easier, but kind of in the middle of your presentation, he asked, what are some of the science questions that the ecological study is addressing?
Ron, hi Ron. And when you say the ecological study, do you mean the ecological surveys, the index site surveys that we're establishing?
That's right.
Hi Ron. What we're trying to do is establish transects within different kelp beds around Puget Sound. And we did our first one at the Edmonds kelp bed in 2020. And we're trying to quantify and sort of assess presence or absence of different marine invertebrate species and also fish communities, the degree to which the substrate is covered in understory kelps. And we've sort of worked up some of these, some of the protocols, customized the protocols, particularly with regard to the fish surveys, working with people at NOAA like Kelly Andrews and his crew, so that we're really trying to document abundance of species within kelp beds at various places within Puget Sound, so that we can track how that abundance and diversity varies over time. But I do want to say, and hopefully, Ron, I've answered that question. I'm happy to have many long and continued conversations with you. But Ron is one of the people who shared with me such a just a story of his about being in an eelgrass meadow and hearing photosynthesis happening around him, hearing that the eelgrass emitting oxygen that became like bubbles that were popping like champagne corks, and just sort of the role that submerged aquatic species play in the marine ecosystem. And so we sort of have taken that forward into kelp in terms of understanding the power of photosynthesis provided by kelps and eelgrass in terms of capturing that carbon and oxygenating the waters around those kelp beds and eelgrass beds during the day, during that photosynthesis. And it's really an incredible feature of this estuary, this fjord in which we all live. So thanks to Tom for all of his knowledge that he shared with many of us over the years, and all the stories that make it real, right?
So I was going to save this, but just want to remind people in this lecture, our January speaker is Ron Tom, who, as Betsy just basically described, is eelgrass expert and superhero, defender of eelgrass, and many other things. So I don't want to limit that description, but January 10th, he will be the lecturer in our series. So we're really looking forward to that as well. And thank you for making that so easy for me, Betsy.
It was Ron, really, who made that easy.
We have just a couple more minutes. I had a question from one of our volunteers, Daryl Franco, who asked about, now I have to go, he had a couple of questions. where's the first one, Daryl? He was asking, he's seen groups monitoring kelp beds near North Beach in Port Townsend, and is there a Puget Sound Restoration Fund project related, or is that project related to anything you're doing? Or
Yeah, great question. And it gives me a chance to say that the Jefferson County Marine Resources Committee is doing kayak-based monitoring at that North Beach kelp bed, and going out and measuring sort of the coverage, the spatial coverage of that kelp bed. And this is part of a broader monitoring program that was initiated by the Northwest Straits Commission. And so there's monitoring going on in other North Sound counties as well. And it's a great way for kayakers to get involved in a citizen science project. That North Beach kelp bed is super important for us and our work at Puget Sound Restoration Fund, because it's a place that hosts a year-round bull kelp bed. So it's a place where we can get reproductive material that we've used in different experiments over the years. And some of that kelp also can be used to feed the abalone, because bull kelp is one of their favorite foods. So it kind of helps to power our abalone conservation nursery. And I'll tell you, it's a place where I go often. I love that shoreline. You guys are so very lucky. And the kelp is such a significant feature of that shoreline, and it just gives you a sense of how important that material is, not just the material that grows in the water in the near shore, but also the material that gets washed up on the shore and that becomes a part of the life cycle there, as well as that material decomposes and feeds lots of critters. And it just gives you a sense of what an incredible habitat structure it is. So hopefully that gives the person who answered a question, some information. So connecting with the Jefferson County Marine Resources Committee is a really great thing. And then we will be coordinating our expedition with the MRC and many other organizations on the expedition route, so that we can do a kind of beautifully choreographed survey where we've got people underwater collecting certain kind of information, people on the surface in kayaks, people in flights doing overwater mapping. Hopefully we'll have some drones involved. It's gonna be a complicated, choreographed expedition with a lot of different people involved.
so Betsy Carlson, who's our citizen science coordinator, is also the MRC person that you could connect with. And I think we might have, if we didn't put her contact information, is on our website. So that was one of the questions. How can volunteers be involved in the expedition? And where can we put the information about the expedition?
Yes, well, you know what? Dana Oster at Northwest Straits Commission is going to be helping to organize a gathering in Port Townsend, because that will be one of the anchorages. And so there will be a beautiful chance for us to exchange information. And that will be a way for people to participate in the surveys that are being done during the expedition. So I think that she would also be another good connecting point. And then again, we're on the lookout for the expedition boats, boats that can accommodate the scientists from lots of different agencies and tribes, so that we can do the full 7-day route. So if anybody has ideas along those lines, please let me know.
So there is a question that I wish I'd actually asked you earlier on in the flow of the questions, but It's really a basic question about what caused the decimation of the native growth sites of like biological invasive species, man-made, you know,
There's it's bull
huge topic.
kelpin is just one of those black boxes. There's so many basic science questions that haven't yet been answered, and people like Ron Thom and others can help answer those. But I think that there were multiple things that contributed to the decline of kelp beds, and I think part of that is that if you're in a situation where, as a result of sedimentation from the watershed, as a result of maybe some prop damage, as a result of a whole bunch of different things. If a bed sort of gets reduced in size and kind of dips below that critical mass where you don't have quite enough seed supply to maintain that kelp bed, then it's hard to bring it back. It's hard for it to generate that next generation of kelp bed if the seed supply has been diminished. And so that's why we're sort of exploring and developing ways to increase that seed supply, and also then bioassay the kelp in a place to see whether it can make it through the kelp season, and therefore whether we can do scaled up restoration. So a lot of different contributing factors, from water quality and seawater temperature increases. I mean, the list goes on, right?
We're over 4 o'clock. I just want to thank Betsy again for putting this time aside today, and for everyone else who joined us today. I know that I didn't get everybody's questions, and so I'm sure Betsy will be happy to answer questions if you email her. I just want to just remind people that if you're in Fort Worden going for a walk, there's a little enhanced walk activity out on the pier that our AmeriCorps and intern put together. So we invite you to do that with us. Go to our website, take a look at our online activity suggestions for indoor and outdoor activities. And one of them is to share your New Year's resolutions for the environment with us. I'm sure that we would all be inspired to hear what in the world we can all do to keep our environment healthier and make it healthier in the coming year. So just stay in touch with us over our website and social media. And again, thank you so much to Betsy Peabody for making this happen today.
Thanks to everybody for all the questions, and thanks to the Port Townsend Marine Science Center. Really appreciate it.
Everybody stay well, and thank you again.
Okay, thanks.